I'm Ruth, 28 female. I live in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a city that always feels like it's 10 degrees too hot or 10 degrees too cold. As an architectural drafter, my life is about precision and plans, about creating clear blueprints for structures that are meant to last. My own life felt much the same way, carefully constructed, stable, and predictable. I had my job, my close friend Maya, and a relationship with my family that I thought was, if not perfect, at least functional. I had built my life on the foundation of being the responsible one, the one who never asked for much because I never needed to. This is the story of how that foundation crumbled, not because of a natural disaster, but because the people who were supposed to be my shelter in the storm revealed they had left me out in the rain a long, long time ago. It's about how discovering the truth behind a lifetime of quiet betrayals gave me the blueprint to build a new life, one with a much stronger door and a lock only I have the key to. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The first sign of trouble was the smell. It was a damp, earthy scent that clung to the air when I walked into my apartment building after work. I wrinkled my nose, blaming it on the recent stretch of relentless spring rain. The building was old, a charming pre-war structure with good bones but ancient plumbing. I'd lived there for 4 years, and while the occasional groan from the radiators or flicker of the hallway lights was normal, this smell was new. It was the kind of smell that signaled something was fundamentally wrong. I took the stairs to my third-floor unit, the scent growing stronger with each step. By the time I reached my door, a sense of dread had coiled in my stomach. I turned the key, pushed the door open, and my breath caught in my throat. The first thing I saw was my welcome mat, not just damp, but floating in an inch of murky, brown water. My heart plummeted. I stepped inside, the squelch of my shoes echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. The water was everywhere. It covered the hardwood floors I'd spent weekends polishing, creeping up the legs of my sofa and armchair. My bookshelf, filled with expensive architectural textbooks and novels I'd collected since I was a teenager, was sagging, the bottom row of books already swollen and ruined. The source of the disaster was immediately obvious. A huge, discolored patch of ceiling dripped relentlessly above my living room, the plaster bulging like a grotesque blister. The apartment above mine had suffered a major pipe burst, and my home was paying the price. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the violation. It felt deeply personal, as if the water wasn't just ruining my things, but actively washing away the life I had so carefully built. Then, adrenaline kicked in. I sloshed through the water to my bedroom, grabbing my laptop, my hard drives with all my work files, and a handful of clothes that were still dry in the top of my closet. I stuffed them into a backpack, my hands shaking. Every squelching step was a reminder of what I was losing. My renter's insurance would cover some of it, eventually, but insurance adjusters and paperwork couldn't give me back my home tonight. I was, for all intents and purposes, homeless. Once I was outside on the curb, shivering in the damp air, the shock began to recede, replaced by a frantic, buzzing panic. Where would I go? My first instinct, the one ingrained in me since childhood, was to call my parents. My mom, Alina, answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and efficient. "Ruth, hello, is everything all right?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked as I explained the situation, the burst pipe, the flood, the fact that my apartment was uninhabitable. I could practically hear her processing the information, her mind clicking like the gears of a machine. "Oh my," she said, her tone carrying a note of detached sympathy, like a doctor diagnosing a common ailment. "That's terrible. You'll have to call your insurance, of course." I assured her I already had, but the immediate problem was a place to stay. There was a pause on the line, and in that small silence, a sliver of hope wedged itself into my heart. They had a big house, just a 40-minute drive away. They had 2 spare bedrooms, one of which was my old room, still decorated with the pale blue paint I'd picked out when I was 16. "Well," my mother began, her voice taking on a practical, almost managerial tone, "your father and I think the best thing would be for you to find a motel for a few nights. Something affordable. There's that little place off the highway, the Starlight Inn. I'm sure they have rooms. It'll be easier for you to manage everything if you're close. To your apartment. I waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where she would say, but of course you can stay with us if you need to. It never came. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of passing cars on my street. I couldn't believe it. I was her daughter standing on a sidewalk with a backpack full of salvaged belongings, and her first suggestion was a cheap motel. "Mom," I started, my voice small, "are you sure? I could just stay in my old room for a little while, until I figure things out." Another pause, this one tighter. "Ruth, you know how your father gets when the routine is disrupted, and besides, we need to keep the guest room free." I frowned, confused. "Free for what? Are you expecting someone?" "You never know," she said vaguely. "It's just better this way. It will make you more resourceful. Now, I'll text you the number for that motel. Call them before they book up." Before I could argue, before I could even process the coldness in her voice, she ended the call with a brisk, "Talk soon, dear, chin up." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the damp evening air. It was a profound, soul-deep cold. A moment later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. Not an "I love you," not an "Are you safe?" Just a string of digits. The number for the Starlight Inn. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and angry. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over my brother Ethan's name. Maybe he could talk some sense into them, but before I could call, my phone rang. It was Maya. "Hey, I was just about to head home. Saw your text about the flood. Oh my God, Ruth, are you okay? Where are you?" Her voice, warm and genuinely panicked on my behalf, was such a stark contrast to my mother's that it broke me. A sob escaped my lips. "I'm on the curb outside my building," I choked out. "Everything's ruined." "Stay right there," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "Don't call a motel, don't call anyone else, I'm 10 minutes away. You're staying with me, we'll figure out the rest together." When Maya pulled up, she didn't just offer me a ride. She jumped out of the car, wrapped me in a fierce hug, and held on until my shaking subsided. She looked at my soaked backpack and my stunned expression, her eyes full of a righteous anger that I couldn't yet muster for myself. "Get in," she said softly. "Let's go home." As we drove away, leaving my drowned apartment behind, I couldn't shake the image of that text message on my phone. It wasn't just a number. It was a message, loud and clear. In my moment of crisis, the first person to offer me unconditional shelter wasn't my family. It was a friend. The people who were supposed to be my safe harbor had just pointed me toward a sea of strangers, armed with nothing but the number of a cheap motel. The first night at Maya's was a blur of hot tea, borrowed sweatpants, and a level of kindness that felt almost overwhelming. She set me up in her spare room, a cozy space filled with books and a comfortable futon. It was smaller than my childhood bedroom, yet it felt more like a sanctuary than my parents' house ever had. Maya didn't press me for details. She just made sure I ate something, listened while I numbly recounted the conversation with my mother, and refilled my mug every time it got low. Her anger on my behalf was a warm, protective shield. "A motel?" she kept saying, shaking her head in disbelief. "They have a 4-bedroom house, and their daughter is in a crisis, and they suggest a motel? That's not normal, Ruth." I defended them, of course. It was an automatic response, a reflex honed over 28 years. "My dad likes his routine," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "And my mom, she just thinks being independent is important." Maya gave me a look that was equal parts pity and exasperation. "There's a difference between fostering independence and outright abandonment," she said gently. "This isn't about independence. This is about them not showing up for you when you needed them most." I knew she was right, but admitting it felt like a betrayal, even though I was the one who had been betrayed. The next morning, I called my brother, Ethan. He was 2 years older than me, a 30-year-old startup founder who was perpetually on the verge of his big break. He had always been the golden child, the charming, charismatic son who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. His ideas were brilliant, his failures were just learning experiences, and his need for their support was a sign of his ambition, not a flaw. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one. My steady job as a drafter, my meticulously managed budget, my quiet life, These were seen not as accomplishments, but as the expected baseline. I was the reliable, low-maintenance daughter. It was a role I had never asked for, but had played to perfection. Ethan picked up on the third ring, his voice breezy. "Ruthie, WH. "At's up," I explained the flood, my voice still raw. His reaction was a performance of concern. "Oh, wow, that's brutal. So sorry to hear that. You have insurance, right?" It was the same question my mother had asked, a deflection from the human element to the logistical one. "Yes, Ethan, I have insurance," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "But I can't live there. I called Mom and Dad, and they told me to get a motel room." I waited for his outrage for him to say, "No way, that's crazy, come stay with us." He and his wife lived in a 2-bedroom condo just 20 minutes from me. He was silent for a moment. "Well," he said slowly, "I guess they're just trying to give you your space. You know how they are." "My space?" I asked, my voice rising. "Ethan, my apartment is under a foot of water. I don't need space, I need a place to sleep." "Yeah, I get it," he said, but his tone was dismissive. "Look, we'd offer, but things are just really hectic here. We're in the middle of a huge push with the app and the place is a mess. You'd be miserable." The excuse was so flimsy, so transparent, it was insulting. But the final blow came a moment later. "Besides," he added, as if it were an afterthought, "Mom actually called me last night. She wanted to make sure I was okay with all the rain. She said they've got the guest room ready for me, just in case my condo building has any issues. You know how she worries." The world tilted on its axis. My ears started to ring. He said it so casually, without a hint of irony. My apartment was actively flooded, and my mother had offered me the number of a cheap motel. His apartment was perfectly fine, and my mother had offered him a preemptively prepared room in their home. The rejection I had felt the night before was no longer a vague sense of hurt. It was a physical blow, sharp and precise, stealing the air from my lungs. The guest room they needed to keep free wasn't for some hypothetical visitor. It was for him. It was always for him. I was the emergency you outsourced. He was the emergency you sheltered. "Ruth, you there?" Ethan's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. I couldn't speak. All the little moments from our childhood suddenly clicked into place, forming a bleak, suffocating mosaic of favoritism. The way they paid for his entire university tuition, but told me taking out student loans would build character. The way they co-signed for his first car, but lectured me on the importance of a good credit score when I bought my used sedan. The way they celebrated his C-average report cards as signs of a creative mind, while my straight A's were met with a simple, "That's nice, dear." I had always explained it away, telling myself I was more mature, more capable. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. I was worth less. "I have to go," I managed to whisper, and I hung up before he could reply. I slid down the wall in Maya's hallway, wrapping my arms around my knees. I didn't cry. The sadness was too deep for tears. It was a hollow, aching void where the illusion of my family's love had once been. Maya found me there a few minutes later. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just sat down on the floor beside me, put her arm around my shoulders, and waited. That simple act of solidarity was more parental than anything I had received from my own mother and father in the last 24 hours. For years, I had believed that if I was just responsible enough, just independent enough, just needed them less, I would eventually earn their approval. But the conversation with Ethan revealed the devastating truth. It wasn't about my independence. It was about my perceived value. In the family ledger, I was a balanced account, self-sufficient and requiring no investment. Ethan was a high-risk, high-reward venture they were willing to pour endless resources into. The guest room was just another investment. The motel key was my dividend. The next few weeks were a painful exercise in logistics. I spent my days on the phone with the insurance company, my landlord, and a water damage restoration crew. My evenings were spent at Maya's, sifting through lists of new apartments I couldn't afford and trying to piece together a new life. Throughout it all, my family's presence was a ghost in the machine. My mother, Alina, would call every few days, her voice full of a brittle, performative concern. "How is the apartment search coming along, dear?" She'd ask as if she were inquiring about a hobby. She never once asked where I was staying, and I never offered the information. I think, on some level, she preferred not to know, because knowing would require an emotional response she was unwilling to give. She was more comfortable with the idea of me in a sterile, anonymous motel room than in a friend's home, being cared for by someone else. The latter implied a failure on her part, a gap that another person had to fill. My father, Richard, was even more distant. As a retired history professor, a man who was more comfortable with the dead than the living. He left the emotional labor of family management to my mother, and her coldness gave him the perfect cover for his own passivity. He sent me a single text: "Your mother told me about the flood. Let us know if you need anything." The offer was so vague as to be meaningless, a box checked on a list of parental duties. I didn't reply. What could I say? I need parents who act like they care about me. It seemed too much to ask. Ethan, after our stilted phone call, went completely silent. I knew he was avoiding me, likely feeling a flicker of guilt that was inconvenient to his carefully curated life as the favored son. It was during the third week, on a Saturday afternoon, that the first crack appeared in the facade of my family's financial world. I had to go to my parents' house to pick up some important documents I had stored in their safe, my birth certificate and some old savings bonds. I called ahead to make sure they'd be home, the conversation clipped and formal. When I arrived, my dad was the only one there. He was in his study, surrounded by stacks of books, looking flustered. "Ruth, thank goodness," he said, peering at his computer screen over his reading glasses. "I'm trying to pay a bill online, and this website is a labyrinth. Your mother usually handles this." This was typical. My mother, the former bank manager, ran the household finances with an iron fist. My father was a willing financial illiterate. "Sure, Dad, I can help," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. I sat down at his desk, and he logged into their joint bank account. I quickly found the bill payment section and set it up for him. As I was about to log out, he said, "Oh, while you're in there, could you just check the transfer to Ethan? Your mother said she sent it yesterday for his quarterly estimated taxes." My fingers froze over the keyboard. A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. I navigated to the transaction history. I saw their regular pension deposits, mortgage payments, and grocery bills. And then I saw it, a transfer for $5,000 to an account titled Ethan last name. The memo line read, "Q2 business support. It wasn't for taxes. It was a business subsidy." But that wasn't what made me stop breathing. It was the account the money had been transferred from. It wasn't their main checking account. It was an account I had never seen before, labeled E&R Legacy Savings. My parents' names were Alina and Richard. I clicked on it. My heart started hammering against my ribs. The account had a balance of just over $200,000. The transaction history was a roadmap of my brother's adult life. There were huge transfers labeled university tuition, graduation car, apartment down payment, and a steady stream of smaller, four-figure transfers every few months labeled business support or living expenses. It was all there, in black and white. A secret, secondary savings account dedicated almost exclusively to funding my brother. I felt dizzy, the numbers on the screen blurring in front of my eyes. I thought back to my own life. I remembered the pride I'd felt when I paid off my student loans, the culmination of years of working part-time jobs and living on a shoestring budget. I remembered the stress of saving for my own apartment deposit, eating ramen noodles for weeks to scrape the money together. I remembered my parents' lectures on fiscal responsibility, the praise they'd given me for standing on my own 2 feet. It had all been a lie. They weren't teaching me responsibility, they were enforcing a double standard. I wasn't standing on my own 2 feet because I was strong. I was standing on my own 2 feet because they had kicked my ladder out from under me, while Ethan was taking an elevator they had built and paid for. "Find it?" my dad asked, oblivious, peering at a dusty textbook. I clicked back to the main screen, my mind racing. "Yep, all set," I said, my voice miraculously steady. "The transfer went through yesterday." I logged out of the account, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I told him I had what I needed from the safe and fled the house, the documents clutched in my hand like a shield. I sat in my car in their driveway for a long time, the engine off, just trying to breathe. The motel key, the preemptive offer of a room for Ethan, it wasn't just about a moment of crisis. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease. This wasn't just favoritism, it was a calculated, long-term financial strategy. They had created two separate paths for their children. Ethan S. was a smoothly paved highway, paid for with secret money. Mine was a rocky, uphill trail I was expected to climb alone and then be praised for my endurance. The discovery of that second savings account changed everything. My hurt was no longer just a feeling, it had a number attached to it, and I was beginning to realize that the kindness of strangers was nothing compared to the calculated cruelty of family. The drive back to Maya's apartment was a blur. My mind was replaying the numbers I'd seen on that screen, the endless list of transfers to Ethan. Each one felt like a small, personal betrayal. By the time I walked through her door, my carefully constructed composure had shattered. I wordlessly handed Maya my phone, a picture I had discreetly snapped of the computer screen still displayed. It showed the E&R legacy savings account summary and the last few transactions. Maya, with her sharp paralegal mind, took one look and her eyes widened. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just said, "Okay, let's get to work." That night, her cozy living room transformed into a war room. We sat on the floor, surrounded by mugs of tea and a shared laptop, and began to build a timeline. My memory, usually reserved for architectural codes and design specifications, became a forensic tool. My first year of university, I'd say, they told me they could only afford to help with my textbooks. I took out a loan for the rest. Maya would type, creating a spreadsheet. We cross-referenced the date with the transfers I had seen. Sure enough, around the same time, a $15,000 transfer labeled Ethan Creative Writing Semester Abroad had left the secret account. He had spent a semester in Prague, writing what he called his masterpiece, while I had been working shifts at the campus library to afford groceries. The more we dug, the uglier it got. We went through every milestone of my adult life and laid it next to Ethan's. When I was 23, I bought my first car, a reliable but boring 7-year-old sedan. I'd saved for a year for the down payment. My parents had given me a lecture on the evils of dealership financing and made me feel small for even considering it. The secret account showed that 2 months before, they had transferred $25,000 to Ethan for his graduation car, a sporty convertible he'd driven for a year before getting bored and selling it at a loss. When he decided to launch his first startup, a gourmet dog food delivery app, they had funded it with a $50,000 seed investment. When it failed a year later, there were no lectures on fiscal responsibility. There was only another transfer, this one for $10,000, labeled support during transition. Meanwhile, when I had been laid off from my first job during an economic downturn, my mother's advice had been to tighten my belt and hit the pavement harder. Maya was methodical, her legal training shining through. She helped me frame it not just as a series of emotional slights, but as a pattern of deliberate, quantifiable financial disparity. "This isn't just them helping him out," she explained, her voice low and serious. "This is a systematic allocation of family resources. They've been treating you like an independent contractor and him like a wholly owned subsidiary." The analogy was so perfect, so chillingly accurate, it made my stomach churn. The investigation consumed me. It became a grim, obsessive project. I scoured my own old bank statements, finding the paltry $100 checks they'd sent for my birthdays, and remembered Ethan bragging about the new laptop they'd bought him for his. I found the email from my dad explaining that they couldn't help with the deposit for my apartment because their money was all tied up in investments. Looking back, I now knew exactly which investment they meant: Ethan. We estimated that over the past decade, from the secret account alone, they had given Ethan upwards of $300,000. The support I had received in that same period. Maybe $5,000 if I was being generous and included every birthday and Christmas gift. The hardest part was confronting the lies. It wasn't just that they had given him the money, it was that they had actively constructed a narrative around my independence to justify it. They had praised me for the very struggles they had imposed on me. They'd called me the responsible one, not as a compliment, but as an excuse. It was a label that absolved them of any obligation to help me, freeing up their resources and their conscience to focus entirely on my brother. It was a masterpiece of emotional and financial manipulation, and my mother, the former bank manager, had been the architect. One evening, while searching through old digital files on a backup drive, I found a folder labeled Family Documents. Inside, amongst old vacation photos and scanned copies of our report cards, was a subfolder named Financials. My heart hammered in my chest. I clicked it open. It was mostly old tax returns, but one file name stood out: Will and Estate Draft V3. It was dated only 6 months prior. My hand trembled as I opened the PDF. I scrolled past the legal jargon, the designations of my mother and father as executors until I reached the section on beneficiaries. My breath caught in my throat. The language was cold and clinical. The house, the stocks, the primary savings and investment portfolios, the bulk of their considerable estate was to be placed in a trust for my brother, Ethan. He would be the sole beneficiary. My inheritance was a single, stark sentence. To our daughter, Ruth, we bequeath a fixed sum of $50,000 in recognition of her admirable self-sufficiency. I read the words over and over, the phrase admirable self-sufficiency, mocking me from the page. It was the final receipt in a lifetime of unequal transactions. They had monetized my independence. They had put a price tag on my character, and it was a tiny fraction of what they were willing to give my brother for having none. It was their final, posthumous justification for a lifetime of favoritism. I wasn't just being left less, I was being punished for my competence. That document wasn't a will. It was a final invoice, billing me for the crime of never needing them. And in that moment, sitting in the quiet of Maya's apartment, my grief finally hardened into something else. It was cold, it was sharp, and it was clear. It was resolve. Seeing my inheritance laid out in black and white was a strange, clarifying experience. The raw, emotional hurt that had been churning inside me for weeks began to cool and solidify. It was no longer a messy storm of grief and anger. It was a solid block of ice. The draft of the will, combined with the secret bank account, wasn't just evidence of favoritism. It was a blueprint of my family's entire value system. And in that blueprint, I was a minor feature, an afterthought, a load-bearing wall they took for granted but never admired. I showed the document to Maya. She read it slowly, her expression growing sterner with each line. When she got to the phrase admirable self-sufficiency, she let out a short, sharp breath of disbelief. "Oh, that's just cruel," she whispered. "That's not just disinheritance, Ruth, that's a justification. They're writing their own history, and in their version, you're the hero who doesn't need a reward." She tapped her finger on the screen. But here's the thing about legal documents, even drafts. They reveal intent, and their intent is crystal clear. For a few days, I was adrift. What do you do with information like that? What's the appropriate response to discovering your entire life has been built on a foundation of lies? A part of me wanted to scream, to call them and unleash a torrent of rage and pain. Another part of me wanted to just disappear, to cut them off without a word and let them wonder why. But both options felt unsatisfying. Ranting would give them the opportunity to dismiss me as hysterical. Disappearing would allow them to continue believing their own narrative, that I was simply the distant, self-sufficient daughter who drifted away. Neither option held them accountable. It was Maya who helped me find a third path. "You're an architectural drafter, right?" she asked me one evening. "You take a client's messy ideas and you turn them into a precise, logical plan. You need to do the same thing here. You can't fight their emotional narrative with more emotion. You have to fight their flawed blueprint with a better one." The analogy clicked. For my entire life, I had been trying to operate within their floor plan, trying to find my place in a structure that was fundamentally designed to exclude me. It was time to draw my own. My plan began to take shape, not as a fiery act of revenge, but as a cool, methodical demolition. The goal wasn't to destroy them, but to dismantle the false structure of our family and force them, for once, to see the bare, unvarnished truth. I didn't want their money. I realized with a startling clarity that if they had offered me half their fortune tomorrow, I would have refused it. It was tainted. What I wanted was something far more valuable, an acknowledgement. I wanted to look them in the eyes, as the carefully constructed walls of their delusion came tumbling down. The first step was to secure my own foundation. I stopped looking for apartments I could barely afford and started looking for smaller, more practical places. I found a studio in a clean, quiet building in a neighborhood I liked. It was a fresh start. I used the money I had been saving for a house down payment, a fund I had built with my own hard work, a fact that now filled me with a fierce pride, to pay the deposit and first month's rent. The day I signed the lease, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in my entire life. I was building something that was entirely my own. The second step was to gather my materials. I spent a weekend meticulously organizing everything I had discovered. I created a new spreadsheet, even more detailed than the first. It listed every major life event, from university tuition to car purchases to apartment deposits. One column was titled Ruth, the other was Ethan. I entered the financial support each of us had received for each event. The final tally at the bottom was stark. Ethan's column showed a figure over $300,000. Mine showed less than $5,000. I printed the spreadsheet in a clear, bold font. Then, I printed copies of the key bank statements from the secret account, highlighting the most egregious transfers. Finally, I printed the relevant section of the draft will. I placed all of it into a slim, professional-looking black binder, creating tabs for each section: educational support, housing support, business investment, and estate planning. It looked like a business proposal, and in a way, it was. It was a proposal for a new kind of family dynamic, one based on truth. The final part of the plan was the presentation itself. I couldn't do it at their house. That was their territory, their power base. It had to be on my ground. I decided to host a dinner at my new apartment. The invitation would be simple and impossible to refuse: a housewarming and thank you dinner. It was the perfect trap, baited with the very role they had assigned me, the grateful, independent daughter. I would invite my mother, my father, and Ethan. I would cook a nice meal. I would let them sit in the apartment that I had secured without their help, and then, for dessert, I would serve them the truth. Maya was worried. "Are you sure you can handle this?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. "It's going to be incredibly difficult." "I know," I told her, the black binder feeling heavy in my hands. "But for 28 years, I've been the quiet one. I've been the one who smooths things over, the one who doesn't make waves. They are so used to that version of me that they won't see this coming. It's time they saw the final design." I was no longer the girl they could send to a motel. I was the architect of my own life now, and I was about to conduct the final inspection of theirs. The week leading up to the dinner was surreal. I moved into my new studio, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture with a sense of calm purpose. The apartment was small, but every inch of it was mine. There were no ghosts here, no lingering expectations or quiet disappointments. It was a blank slate. I invited my family via group text, keeping the tone light and cheerful. "Hi, everyone. I'm finally settled in my new place, and I'd love to have you over for a small housewarming dinner this Saturday. I want to thank you all for your support during this crazy time." The lie felt slick and easy, a necessary camouflage. My mother responded almost immediately. "How lovely, dear. We'd be delighted. What can we bring?" Her enthusiasm felt like a victory. They were walking into my world on my terms. Ethan's reply was more subdued. A simple "sounds great. See you then." He was probably relieved, thinking this dinner meant I was over the whole motel incident and things could go back to normal. The concept of normal was about to be permanently redefined. On Saturday, I cooked. I made a simple, elegant meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, a fresh salad. I set the small table with the new plates and silverware I had bought myself. Everything was deliberate. I wanted the scene to be as non-confrontational as possible, a picture of domestic tranquility. The black binder sat on the kitchen counter, hidden beneath a dish towel. They arrived precisely at 7, bringing a bottle of overpriced wine. My mother, Eleanor, swept into the room, her eyes scanning every detail of my small apartment. "Oh, it's cozy, Ruth," she said, the word hanging in the air, loaded with unspoken judgment. In her mind, cozy was a euphemism for small, a confirmation that my life was less expansive than the one she had funded for my brother. My father, Richard, gave me an awkward hug, and Ethan followed, flashing his signature charming smile. "Place looks great, Ruthie," he said. "Really landed on your feet." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. We ate. The conversation was stilted, full of the meaningless chatter that had characterized our family gatherings for years. They asked about my job, I asked about Dad's garden. Ethan talked at length about a new feature for his app, a topic that made my parents light up with interest. I let them talk, playing the part of the gracious host, the quiet daughter. I watched them, really watched them, for the first time without the filter of hope or love. I saw my mother's sharp, calculating gaze. I saw my father's intellectual detachment. And I saw my brother's easy, unearned confidence, the confidence of a man who has never had to worry about the floor falling out from under him because he knows his parents have installed a safety net made of cash. When dinner was over and I was clearing the plates, I took a deep breath. "Before we have dessert," I said, my voice even, "there's just one thing I'd like to share with you all." I walked to TH. E-Counter picked up the black binder and placed it in the center of the table. 3 pairs of eyes stared at it, confused. "What's this, dear?" my mother asked. "A work project." "In a way," I replied. I opened the binder to the first tab, the spreadsheet comparing the financial support Ethan and I had received over the years. I turned it so they could all see. "I'm calling this project a final inspection," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I've been doing a review of the family's structural integrity, and I found some serious issues." Silence. My father put on his reading glasses and squinted at the page. Ethan's smile faltered. My mother's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing. "I don't understand," she said, her voice sharp. "What is this supposed to be?" "It's a balance sheet," I said calmly. "It's a record of the family's investments in its children. For example, under educational support, you'll see an entry for Ethan's semester abroad, paid for by you. My corresponding entry is student loans." I flipped the page to the bank statements. This was funded by a savings account I wasn't aware of. An account that has paid for Ethan's car, his apartment down payment, and his business ventures to the tune of over $300,000. Ethan's face went pale. My father looked from the paper to my mother, his expression one of dawning horror and confusion. My mother, however, did not flinch. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "You went through our private financial records?" she hissed. "This is a disgusting invasion of privacy." "I helped Dad pay a bill," I said, my gaze unwavering. "And I saw an account I didn't recognize. But you're right, the numbers aren't the most important part. The most important part is the story you told me while you were doing this." The story was about my admirable self-sufficiency. I flipped to the final tab, the excerpt from the will. "You were so proud of my independence that you decided to write it into your will. You were going to reward my self-sufficiency with a pittance, while leaving the entire estate to the son you spent a fortune ensuring would never have to be self-sufficient." "The dam broke. This is outrageous," my mother snapped, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "We have every right to do what we want with our money. We helped Ethan because he needed it. He's a creative and entrepreneur. Your path was more straightforward." "My path was straightforward because you left me no other choice," I said, my voice finally rising, not with hysteria, but with a powerful, righteous anger. "You didn't praise my independence, you manufactured it out of neglect. You left me on the side of the road in the middle of a crisis and told me to find a motel, while you kept a room warm for your precious son, just in case. That one act told me everything I needed to know. This binder is just the proof." I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. He had known, maybe not the exact numbers, but he had known he was on an elevator while I was taking the stairs. He had always known, and then I looked at my father. He looked broken, his eyes filled with a dawning shame. He had allowed this to happen, retreating into his books while my mother engineered our lives. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is this true?" My mother shot him a look of pure venom. "Don't be a fool, Richard. We were just being practical." The final inspection was complete. The foundation was rotten, just as I had suspected. "I don't want your money," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, firm tone. "I want you to know that I see you. I see all of it. And I'm done. This dinner was not a thank you. It was a goodbye." The explosion that followed my final sentence was everything I had expected. My mother, Alina, launched into a tirade, her voice vibrating with a rage that was equal parts indignation and panic. She called me ungrateful, malicious, and cruel. She accused me of trying to tear the family apart. It was a masterful performance, designed to paint me as the villain, the unstable daughter who would stoop to airing the family's private finances out of jealousy. But her words had no effect on me. For the first time in my life, her disapproval was just noise. I had the truth on my side, laid out in the black binder that still sat in the middle of the table like a silent, irrefutable judge. My father, Richard, was a ghost. He just sat there, his face pale, looking at the spreadsheet and then at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time. The historian was finally being confronted with a history he couldn't ignore, a primary source document of his own quiet complicity. Ethan was the most pathetic of all. He tried to defend himself, stammering about the pressures of his startup and how it wasn't as easy as it looked. He claimed he had no idea about the scale of the financial disparity. The lie was so transparent that even he didn't seem to believe it. He couldn't look me in the eye, he couldn't look at anyone. I didn't engage, I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply stood by the door of my apartment and waited. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. It was the calmest I had ever felt in their presence. My mother, realizing she had lost control of the situation, grabbed her purse. "Fine," she spat, "but don't come crying to us when you need something. This door is closed." "No," I said softly, looking around at the walls of my own small, perfect space. "This door is mine, and I'm the one closing it." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had no response. For the first time, I had written a line she didn't have a script for. She, Richard, and Ethan filed out of my apartment, leaving the bottle of wine untouched on the counter. I closed the door behind them, and the silence that filled the room was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. In the weeks and months that followed, they tried every tactic. First came the barrage of angry texts from my mother, followed by manipulative voicemails about how I was breaking my father's heart. When I didn't respond, the strategy shifted. My father started calling, his voice pleading and weak, asking me to just talk to your mother and try to smooth things over. He wanted to go back to the comfortable silence of his study, and my truth was a discordant note he couldn't bear. I told him, gently but firmly, that my relationship with my mother was no longer his to manage. Ethan's attempts were the most telling. He sent long, rambling emails about how the stress of his business had made him blind to things, and how he always saw me as the strong, capable sister. He was still playing his part, still trying to use the narrative they had created to his advantage. He even offered to help me out with a small loan, an offer so gallingly tone-deaf that I had to laugh. It was a power play, an attempt to re-establish the financial hierarchy where he was the benefactor and I was the one in need. I deleted the emails without replying. I leaned on Maya, who was my rock. She helped me change my phone number and set up filters on my email. She reminded me that their reaction was not a sign of my cruelty, but a confirmation of their guilt. I focused on my work, pouring my energy into my designs. My boss noticed my renewed focus and gave me the lead on a challenging new project, a community library. The irony was not lost on me. I was designing a building for the public, a place of quiet strength and accessible knowledge, while the foundations of my own private family home had been condemned. About 6 months after the dinner, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It was from a law firm. My hands trembled as I opened it. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a revised draft of my parents' will, sent to me by their lawyer. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I read it. The new version was meticulously, almost comically, fair. The estate was to be divided into 2 perfectly equal shares. The trust for Ethan was gone. The line about my admirable self-sufficiency had been deleted. It was a document stripped of all its previous narrative and emotion, reduced to a cold, legal equation. It was, in its own way, an admission of guilt, the only one I would ever receive. I folded the papers and put them in a drawer. It didn't matter. They were still trying to speak to me in the only language they understood, money, and I was no longer listening. My life is quiet now, but it is a real quiet, not the tense silence of things left unsaid. It's the quiet of a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and a good book. It's the quiet of focused work, of drawing lines that I know will become real, tangible structures. I have my work, I have Maya, and I have a small circle of friends who value me for who I am, not for the role I play. I am no longer the responsible daughter or the self-sufficient sister. I am just Ruth. Some days there is a pang of sadness for the family I wish I had, but it's a fleeting ache, like a phantom limb. The space they occupied has been filled with self-respect and peace. I built a life for myself, not out of spite or for revenge, but because I had to. I had to draw my own blueprint, and every day I get to live inside the beautiful, sturdy home I built, standing proudly behind my own front door.